The sun hung low over the sprawling Tesla dealership in Southern California, casting long shadows across the sleek electric cars lined up like silent sentinels. Inside, the air buzzed with the hum of routine, salespeople drifting between customers, with practiced smiles, their voices smooth as polished chrome. It was a typical Tuesday, the kind where ambition and boredom wrestled in equal measure, until a figure stepped through the glass doors. He wore a faded baseball cap pulled low, a pair of scuffed sneakers, and a nondescript jacket that seemed plucked from a thrift store bin. To the untrained eye, he was just another curious walk-in, maybe a tire kicker with no real intent to buy. But beneath the disguise was Elon Musk, the enigmatic billionaire himself, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a predator's focus. He'd come unannounced, driven by a restless curiosity that had been gnawing at him for weeks. What did his employees really think of him? How did they treat the people who walked into his world, the empire he'd built from scratch? Were they ambassadors of his vision, or just clock punchers coasting on his name? The idea had struck him late one night, alone in his sprawling mansion, the silence broken only by the hum of his own thoughts. He'd seen the reports, the whispers online, the occasional leaked video of Tesla staff acting less than stellar. Was it true? Could the people he trusted to carry his legacy be tarnishing it instead? The questions burned, and so here he was, shedding his public persona like a snake sheds skin. Slipping into the dealership to find out, Elon moved toward a row of gleaming Model Ys, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his gait deliberately casual. He lingered near one, running a finger along its curve, testing the waters. A salesman approached, a wiry guy in his 30s with a name tag reading, Kyle. His stride was confident, his smile tight, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. He sized Elon up in a glance, pegging him as a nobody, a waste of time. The interaction began innocently enough. Elon asking basic questions about range and charging times, his voice low and unassuming. Kyle answered with a clipped tone, his impatience simmering just beneath the surface, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Elon noticed, his jaw tightening slightly, but he pressed on, probing deeper, watching the man's facade begin to crack. What Kyle didn't know, couldn't know, was that the scruffy customer before him wasn't just some random guy off the street. This was the mind behind Tesla, the architect of the very machines he was dismissing with lazy shrugs. And as the minutes ticked by, Elon felt a flicker of something dark ignite inside him, a mix of disbelief and anger. How could someone representing his company act this way? Was this the norm, or just a fluke? The tension coiled tighter with every word, every gesture, setting the stage for a collision neither man could yet foresee. For now, Elon played along, letting Kyle dig his own grave, one careless remark at a time. Kyle's impatience grew more palpable as Elon lingered near the Model Y, his questions sharpening with an edge that hinted at more than casual interest. The salesman shifted his weight, arms crossing briefly before dropping back to his sides, his body language screaming boredom. To him, this scruffy guy in the worn jacket was just another dreamer, someone who'd ask a dozen questions, take a test drive, then walk away empty-handed. Elon caught the subtle eye roll, the faint sigh Kyle let slip when he thought no one was paying attention. It was a small thing, but it landed like a spark on dry grass, fueling the slow burn of irritation in Elon's chest. He'd built Tesla to redefine the world, not to be shrugged off by some mid-level employee who couldn't be bothered. Elon pivoted, steering the conversation toward the finer details of the car's software, tossing out specifics about over-the-air updates and battery efficiency. He wanted to see how deep Kyle's knowledge ran, how much he cared about the product he was selling. The answers came back shallow, half-hearted, laced with a condescending tone that suggested Elon was asking dumb questions. Kyle leaned against the car, one hand resting on the hood like he owned it, his posture casual to the point of disrespect. He didn't notice the way Elon's eyes narrowed, the slight clench of his fists inside his pockets. The billionaire was testing him, and Kyle was failing, spectacularly, without even realizing it. The dealership's polished floors reflected the overhead lights, a sterile glow that contrasted with the growing storm brewing between the two men. Other employees milled about, oblivious, tending to their own customers or shuffling paperwork behind the counter. A woman in a sharp blazer glanced over briefly, sensing something off, but she turned away, dismissing it as nothing. Elon, meanwhile, felt the heat rising in his veins. This wasn't just about one rude salesman anymore. It was about what Kyle represented. If this was how his people treated strangers, what did that say about the culture he'd fostered? The thought gnawed at him, a splinter under his skin, urging him to push harder, to peel back the layers of this encounter until the truth lay bare. Then it happened. Kyle, growing bolder in his apathy, cut Elon off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave. He suggested in a tone dripping with sarcasm that maybe Elon should stick to something simpler if he couldn't grasp the basics. The words hung in the air, heavy and reckless, a match tossed into the gasoline-soaked tension. Elon's head tilted slightly, his disguise still holding, but his patience fraying at the edges. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, steady hum, asking Kyle to repeat himself. The salesman obliged, doubling down, unaware that he'd just crossed a line there was no coming back from. The air between Elon and Kyle thickened, charged with an electricity that crackled just beneath the surface. Kyle's repeated jab, delivered with a smirk that oozed arrogance, landed like a slap. Elon stood still for a moment, his disguised figure unassuming to the casual observer, but inside, a tempest was brewing. He'd come here to observe, to test, not to be insulted by someone who didn't even know the half of what he was talking about. The salesman's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a brick in the wall of disrespect that was rapidly rising between them. Elon's hands slid out of his pockets, fingers flexing subtly, a sign of the restraint he was fighting to maintain. Kyle, oblivious to the shift, leaned back against the Model Y, crossing his arms with a casual defiance that suggested he'd won some imaginary battle. He didn't see the way Elon's eyes darkened, the way his breathing steadied into something deliberate, controlled. The billionaire took a measured step forward, closing the gap, his voice low but cutting as he asked, Kyle, what gave him the right to talk down to anyone? The question wasn't loud, wasn't theatrical, but it carried a weight that made the salesman blink, his smirk faltering for the first time. Something in the stranger's tone, in the intensity of his gaze, pricked at Kyle's confidence, though. He quickly masked it with a scoff. Around them, the dealership's rhythm stuttered. A few heads turned, sensing the shift in atmosphere, though no one intervened. The woman in the blazer from earlier paused mid-stride, her clipboard forgotten as she watched the exchange unfold. Kyle straightened, his posture stiffening as he fired back, his voice rising just enough to draw more eyes. He accused Elon of wasting his time, of acting like he knew more than the people who worked here every day. The irony was lost on him, but not on Elon, whose lips twitched in a faint, humorless smile. The salesman's bravado was a house of cards, and Elon was about to blow it down. The confrontation escalated as Kyle's irritation boiled over. He stepped into Elon's space, jabbing a finger toward his chest, his words sharp and personal now, mocking the stranger's appearance, his persistence. Elon didn't flinch, didn't back away. Instead, he met Kyle's gaze head-on, his silence more menacing than any shout. The room seemed to shrink, the hum of conversation fading as more employees and customers turned to watch, drawn by the raw energy of the moment. Kyle, caught up in his own momentum, didn't notice the crowd forming, didn't see the trap he was walking into, but Elon did, and he was ready to spring it. The standoff reached a fever pitch as Kyle's finger hovered inches from Elon's chest, his voice climbing with every word, a mix of frustration and bravado that filled the showroom. The salesman's face flushed red, his eyes wild with the kind of reckless energy that comes from underestimating an opponent. Elon stood rooted, his disguised frame a quiet fortress against the onslaught, absorbing every insult, every jab, like a sponge soaking up fuel for the fire he was about to unleash. The crowd around them grew, a loose circle of curious onlookers, some clutching phones, others whispering to each other, drawn by the spectacle unfolding before them. Kyle, emboldened by the attention, pressed harder, his tone shifting from mockery to outright aggression. He challenged Elon's right to question him, his knowledge, his presence in the dealership, each word a swing meant to knock the stranger down a peg. But Elon didn't bend. His stillness was unnerving, a calm that contrasted sharply with Kyle's unraveling composure. The billionaire's mind raced, cataloging every misstep, every sign of disrespect. His anger no longer a flicker but a steady flame. He'd come here to see the truth, and now he had it, raw and unfiltered, staring him in the face through Kyle's sneering expression. Then, the tipping point came. Kyle, caught in the heat of his own tirade, made a fatal mistake. He sneered about Tesla itself, calling it overrated, a hype machine propped up by a figurehead who didn't even understand the cars. The words sliced through the air, a direct hit at Elon's core, and for the first time the disguised mogul reacted. His head tilted slightly, a predator sizing up prey, and his voice cut through the noise, low and deliberate, asking Kyle if he really believed that. The question hung there, sharp and loaded, a challenge disguised as curiosity. Kyle, too far gone to sense the danger, doubled down, his response dripping with disdain, oblivious to the noose tightening around him. The woman in the blazer, now fully alert, stepped closer, her eyes darting between the two men. She sensed something bigger at play, a gut feeling she couldn't shake, but she didn't act. Not yet. The crowd murmured, tension rippling through them as Elon's demeanor shifted. He straightened, his shoulders squaring, the casual slouch of his disguise giving way to something commanding. He wasn't just a customer anymore. He was a force, and Kyle, in his blind arrogance, had no idea what he'd awakened. The stage was set, the fuse lit, and the explosion was moments away. The showroom's polished calm shattered as Elon's presence transformed, his disguised slouch replaced by a stance that radiated authority. Kyle's latest barb, a careless swipe at Tesla's foundation, lingered in the air, a taunt that had finally snapped the thin thread of Elon's restraint. The billionaire's eyes locked onto the salesman, piercing through the cap's shadow, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, now a tight knot of onlookers, sensed the shift, their whispers fading into a tense silence. Even the woman, in the blazer, froze, her clipboard clutched like a shield, as if she knew something monumental was about to break. Elon stepped forward, closing the last sliver of space between them, his voice steady but laced with a cold fury that made Kyle's bravado flicker. He asked the salesman, point blank, who he thought built Tesla, who poured their life into every bolt, every line of code. The question wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that pressed down on the room, exposing Kyle's ignorance in a single, surgical strike. The salesman faltered, his confidence cracking, but he scrambled to recover, tossing out a flippant answer that only dug his hole deeper. He didn't know, didn't care, and that was the point Elon seized on, his anger now a blade honed to a razor's edge. The confrontation erupted as Elon shed the last pretense of his disguise. He pulled off the cap, letting it drop to the floor, revealing the face that graced headlines and billboards worldwide. Gasps rippled through the crowd, phones thrust upward to capture the moment, as Kyle's expression morphed from defiance to stunned disbelief. The salesman's mouth opened, then closed, words failing him as the reality crashed down. Elon didn't stop there. He tore into Kyle, his voice rising now, detailing the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the vision that Kyle had just spat on with his careless arrogance. Each word landed like a hammer, stripping away the salesman's bravado until he stood exposed, small and shrinking. The woman in the blazer finally moved, pushing through the crowd, her face pale with recognition. She tried to intervene, her voice shaky as she addressed Elon by name, pleading for calm, but he waved her off, his focus locked on Kyle. The salesman, cornered and reeling, tried to backtrack, his apologies stumbling out in a frantic rush, but it was too late. Elon's fury wasn't just personal now, it was a reckoning, a public purging of the disrespect he'd uncovered. The room pulsed with the raw emotion of it all, and Kyle's fate hung by a thread, fraying with every second. The revelation of Elon's identity sent a shockwave through the dealership, the air thick with the weight of his presence. Kyle stood frozen, his face a mask of panic, as the crowd's murmurs swelled into a low roar, phones flashing like a storm of fireflies. The salesman's earlier swagger had evaporated, leaving behind a shell of a man who just realized he'd taunted a giant. Elon, towering over him now in both stature and fury, didn't relent. His voice cut through the chaos, recounting. The blood and sweat poured into Tesla, the countless hours he'd spent to make it more than just a car company. Each sentence was a blow, dismantling Kyle's arrogance with surgical precision, leaving no room for retreat. The woman in the blazer, her authority crumbling under the weight of the moment, tried again to step in. She reached for Elon's arm, her tone desperate as she begged him to lower his voice, to take this somewhere private, but he shook her off with a look that silenced her. This wasn't about discretion anymore, it was about principle. Kyle had crossed a line not just with him, but with everything Tesla stood for, and Elon intended to make an example of him. The crowd leaned in, riveted, some nodding in silent agreement, others gaping at the sheer intensity of the exchange. The salesman's eyes darted around, seeking an escape, but there was none. Not with Elon bearing down like a force of nature. Kyle's attempts at apology grew more frantic, his voice cracking as he stammered out excuses, blaming stress, a bad day, anything to deflect the blame. Elon wasn't having it. He countered each plea with a pointed question, forcing Kyle to face the depth of his disrespect. Why insult a customer? Why mock the company that paid his bills? The salesman had no answers, only a growing desperation that made him look smaller with every passing second. The room pulsed with the raw emotion of the moment, a mix of outrage and vindication, as Elon's words painted a picture of betrayal that hit harder than any physical strike. The woman in the blazer, now visibly shaken, pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed someone higher up the chain. She whispered urgently, glancing at Elon, then at Kyle, her face a map of dread. The call connected, and her hushed tones carried a plea for backup, a sign that this had spiraled beyond her control. Elon noticed, his gaze flicking to her briefly, but his focus remained on Kyle, unrelenting. The salesman's fate was sealed, and the only question left was how public his downfall would be. The tension coiled tighter, the crowd holding its breath, waiting for the hammer to fall. The dealership's atmosphere crackled with anticipation as the woman in the blazer spoke hurriedly into her phone, her voice a low hum against the rising tide of Elon's wrath. Kyle, cornered and shrinking, looked like a man watching his own ship sink, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that no apology could undo what he'd set in motion. Elon stood over him, his presence commanding, his anger no longer a wildfire but a focused beam, searing through the salesman's defenses. The crowd pressed closer, their phones still raised, capturing every second of the unraveling drama, a real-time chronicle of a man's reckoning. Elon shifted his approach, his voice dropping to a steely calm that somehow felt more menacing than his earlier fury. He began dissecting Kyle's behavior piece by piece, laying bare the entitlement, the laziness, the disrespect that had festered unchecked. He spoke of the trust he'd placed in his employees, the expectation that they'd uphold the values he'd fought to instill, and how Kyle had failed spectacularly at every turn. The salesman squirmed, his hands twitching at his sides, his face a blotchy red as the words stripped him raw. The crowd absorbed it all, some nodding grimly, others whispering in awe at the sheer force of Elon's conviction. The woman in the blazer ended her call, her expression tight with dread as she slipped the phone back into her pocket. She stepped forward again, this time with more resolve, addressing Elon directly, her tone a mix of deference and urgency. She suggested they move to the back office, away from the growing audience, but Elon dismissed her with a sharp gesture. This wasn't a private matter anymore. It was a lesson, a public purging of rot within his ranks. Kyle, sensing the shift, tried one last time to salvage himself, his voice breaking as he pleaded for a second chance, claiming he'd learned his lesson. Elon's response was a cold stare, a silence that said more than words ever could. Footsteps echoed from the rear of the showroom, cutting through the tension. A man in a crisp suit emerged, his face stern, his pace brisk as he navigated the crowd. He was the regional manager, summoned by the blazer woman's call, and his arrival shifted the dynamic once more. He glanced at Elon, then at Kyle, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the scene. The crowd parted slightly, giving him space, their anticipation palpable. Elon turned to face him, his posture unyielding, ready to hand down the verdict that had been building since the moment. Kyle opened his mouth. The air grew heavy, the moment of judgment imminent, and Kyle's future hung by a thread. The regional manager's arrival sliced through the charged silence, his polished shoes clicking against the showroom floor as he approached. His face was a mask of professionalism, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as they darted between Elon and the trembling Kyle. The crowd shifted, their collective gaze locking onto this new player, sensing the climax drawing near. Elon stood tall, his cap still discarded on the floor, his identity no longer a secret, but a weapon, wielded with precision. The woman in the blazer hovered nearby, her hands clasped tightly, her earlier attempts at control now reduced to a bystander's role in the unfolding storm. The manager stopped a few feet from Elon, offering a curt nod of recognition, his voice steady as he asked for a rundown of the situation. Elon didn't hesitate. He laid it out, his tone clipped and factual, recounting Kyle's disrespect, his mockery of Tesla, his utter disregard for the company's ethos. Each point landed like a stone, building a case that left no room for ambiguity. The manager listened, his expression hardening with every word, his glance toward Kyle sharpening into something cold, unforgiving. The salesman shrank further, his shoulders hunching, his earlier defiance now a distant memory as the weight of his actions settled fully upon him. When Elon finished, the manager turned to Kyle, his voice low but firm, asking for his side. The salesman stumbled through a response, his words a jumbled mess of excuses and half-truths, his desperation palpable. He gestured weakly, claiming misunderstanding, stress, anything to shift the blame, but the manager's face remained stony. The crowd watched, riveted, some shaking their heads in quiet disgust, others leaning forward, eager for the verdict. Elon crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering, a silent judge overseeing the proceedings, his presence amplifying the stakes. The manager didn't deliberate long. He cut Kyle off mid-sentence, his tone final as he declared the salesman's behavior unacceptable, a betrayal of Tesla's standards. He fired him on the spot, the words sharp and public echoing through the showroom. Kyle's face drained of color, his mouth opening in a silent protest, but no sound came. The crowd erupted in murmurs, a mix of shock and satisfaction, phones still rolling as the moment cemented itself in real time. Elon nodded once, a gesture of approval, his anger easing into something like grim resolve. The hammer had fallen, and the lesson was clear. The echo of the manager's words lingered in the showroom, a death knell for Kyle's career that left the air heavy with finality. The salesman stood motionless, his face a pale canvas of disbelief, eyes darting as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. The crowd buzzed with restless energy, their murmurs swelling into a low hum, some recording the scene with steady hands, others exchanging glances of vindicated awe. Elon watched it all, his arms still crossed, his expression a mix of satisfaction and lingering disdain. The regional manager stepped back, his stern gaze fixed on Kyle, ensuring the message sank in, while the woman in the blazer hovered uselessly, her authority stripped bare by the day's events. Kyle's legs seemed to give slightly, a stumble. He caught just in time, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He turned to Elon, his voice a ragged whisper, pleading for reconsideration, a last-ditch grasp at mercy. But Elon's response was unrelenting. He stepped closer, his presence towering, and dismantled the plea with a calm, cutting clarity. He spoke of accountability, of the privilege Kyle had squandered, of the insult he'd delivered not just to him, but to every person who'd poured their soul into Tesla. The words were a public flaying, stripping away the salesman's dignity. In front of the watching crowd, each syllable a nail in the coffin of his tenure. The manager intervened, his tone brusque as he ordered Kyle to gather his things and leave, pointing toward the back exit with a gesture that brooked no argument. The salesman hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mix of shame and defiance, but the weight of the room pressed down on him. The crowd parted as he shuffled toward the counter, his steps slow, his head bowed under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. Phones followed his retreat, capturing the walk of shame, a digital record of his fall. Elon remained where he was, a sentinel of justice, his gaze tracking Kyle's every move, ensuring the lesson was fully absorbed. As Kyle disappeared behind the counter, the tension in the showroom began to shift, the raw edge of confrontation giving way to a strange, electric triumph. The manager turned to Elon, offering a quiet word of apology, a promise to review staff training, but Elon waved it off. His point had been made, his presence a catalyst that had purged the rot in real time. The crowd's energy turned upward, some clapping softly, others nodding in approval, a collective release of the pent-up emotion that had gripped them. The stage was set for closure, and Elon was ready to deliver it. Kyle's figure vanished into the back of the dealership, the clatter of his belongings being hastily gathered a faint echo against the showroom's polished walls. The crowd's attention swung back to Elon, their eyes bright with a mix of admiration and disbelief, phones still aloft, preserving the aftermath of the storm. The regional manager stood nearby, his stern demeanor softened by a trace of relief, while the woman in the blazer lingered at the edge, her role reduced to a silent witness. The air buzzed with a new energy, the raw confrontation giving way to a swell of triumph that pulsed through the room, a shared victory born from the chaos. Elon turned to face the onlookers, his posture easing, the hard lines of his anger smoothing into something resolute. He didn't shout, didn't grandstand, but his voice carried effortlessly, cutting through the murmurs. He spoke of Tesla's purpose, of the dream that had driven him to build it, of the people who kept it alive every day. He acknowledged the crowd, the customers who'd stood by him, their presence a testament to why he'd come here in the first place. It was a moment of connection, a bridge between the man and the myth, and they leaned into it, their applause growing louder, a wave of affirmation washing over him. The manager stepped forward, seizing the shift, and addressed the staff still scattered around the room. His words were firm, a directive to learn from this, to uphold the standard Kyle had failed to meet, his tone leaving no doubt that change was coming. The employees nodded, some shifting uncomfortably, others standing straighter, the weight of Elon's gaze a silent motivator. The crowd cheered again, their voices rising in a crescendo, a spontaneous eruption of support that drowned out the last traces of tension. Elon raised a hand, a quiet gesture of gratitude, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile that sealed the moment. As the applause faded, Elon moved toward the exit, the crowd parting respectfully, their phones lowering at last. He paused, at the glass doors, glancing back at the showroom, the cars gleaming under the lights, a symbol of what he'd fought to protect. The manager approached, offering a handshake, a promise to follow through, and Elon took it, his grip firm, his nod final. He stepped outside, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting him in a golden glow as he walked away, victorious. The dealership buzzed behind him, alive with the story that would spread far beyond its walls. A tale of reckoning and redemption, complete in its resolution, leaving no thread untied.